but we also have various events. Yesterday was about lesbian in Laos, a movie screening. Today about migration in Thailand. And then next week about funding of civil society. And then we also have some arts workshop about silk screening. So as you can see, it's a very varied program. I am Lia Sciortino and I am the founder of Junction, among other things. But here we have a very distinguished panel, and we will have to keep it to the time because then it becomes to Myanmar. So the main speaker will be Ben because he will give an overview. Ben Atkins, who is the editor of the report, and he will give an overview of the report that you have in your hand. And then we have Olsen from ILO, and she will focus on a chapter which is historical in a way, because for the first time, sex workers are considered workers from the perspective of immigration and from the UN perspective in Thailand. So I think this is quite an important change of attitude. So we can discuss that in the next session. And then we are very pleased also that Kyoko, who is a professor of IT, one of the leading experts on migration in Southeast Asia and the Mekong, and a founder of Junction, a co-founder of Junction, is also here present to provide comments. So please, Glenn.
Hi there. Just want to start by thanking Leah and SEA Junction for hosting this event. Really a big part of the reason why I was advocating for continuing this report in Thailand is because of the rich tradition of independent analysis that Leah and others started on migration issues in Thailand. So it's really fitting that we present the report here at SEA Junction. I also just want to point out that despite all the fancy UN logos you're going to see, this event is entirely funded by SEA Junction. So please do consider making a donation to the organization on your way out. Next slide. So yeah, this report was prepared in collaboration by the members of the United Nations Thematic Working Group on Migration, which is chaired by IOM. The chapters of the report were developed by individual United Nations agencies, and areas of intersection between their mandates were identified to expand interagency cooperation through co-authoring. For those of you who are familiar with the UN system, you're probably aware that this kind of cooperation does not always come easy. And this report really provides a good example of how UN agencies can work together effectively on shared concerns. It's often a bit like herding cats, but I think we got it about right with this report. Over the course of the last year, an extensive peer review was conducted among the members of the working group on the draft chapters of the report to ensure the validity of the analysis. And in addition, the report was shared with the Royal Thai government and leading academics for review and comment prior to publication. Next slide, please. So before we get into the findings, I just want to briefly explain the purpose of the report. With its continued emergence as a key human rights concern within Thailand, there is a manifest need for accurate information and analysis on migration issues. The Thailand Migration Report helps to fill that gap by providing an independent situation analysis of migration trends and patterns. In addition, the report assesses the relevant policy and legislative frameworks for migration in Thailand. And finally, it delivers a set of UN recommendations that offer a way forward for establishing a more long-term, coherent, and rights-based approach to migration governance. So this version of the Thailand Migration Report includes 11 chapters, and those chapters are divided into 5 thematic areas, which were identified as areas of critical importance by the UN Working Group. Section 1 is on migration policy and profile. That includes a chapter on Thailand's migration profile, which was written by IOM and myself. Another on migration policy and practice in Thailand, which was drafted by IOM. Section 2 of the report covers working conditions for migrants, starting with Anna's chapter on working conditions for migrants in Thailand's sex industry. A chapter on working conditions for migrants in Thailand's agricultural sector, which was co-authored by ILO and FAO, and a chapter on working conditions for migrants and IUU fishing in Thailand's fisheries sector, co-authored by FAO and ILO. Section 3 of the report addresses access to services for migrants. It has a chapter on strengthening access to services for migrant children in Thailand. That was co-authored by UNICEF and UNESCO. And also a chapter titled Towards Universal Health Coverage for Migrants in Thailand, which was drafted by WHO. Section 4 of the report examines migration and development issues, which is kind of a new area for the report. It hadn't been addressed before. And it has a chapter on migrant remittances from Thailand to CLMV countries, which was written by UNCDF. And also a chapter on impact of Aussie integration on women migrants in Thailand, drafted by UN Women. The final section of the report covers exploitation of migrants, and that includes a chapter on trafficking in persons in Thailand, which was drafted by UNACT, and also one on the role of the private sector in preventing exploitation of migrants in Thailand, which was co-authored by ILO and IOM. So we don't actually have time to present all of those chapters, of course, today. What we're going to do is Anna's going to present her piece on sex work, and I'm going to briefly cover 6 of the other chapters. We'll see how that goes. So starting with Thailand's migration profile, although migrant workers from neighboring countries constitute the vast majority of Thailand's current population of migrants, its migration flows remain heterogeneous and complex. There are a wide variety of other groups resident within the country who do not hold citizenship status, including stateless persons and ethnic minorities, foreign investors, retirees and spouses, professional and skilled workers, asylum seekers and refugees, and tertiary students. Statistics collated from the most credible sources available now put the total non-Thai population in Thailand at approximately 4.9 million, and that figure represents a substantial increase from the statistics in the 2014 Thailand Migration Report, which estimated the non-Thai population at 3.7 million. The most significant reason for that change is the growing number of migrant workers from CLMV countries in Thailand, which have increased by over 1.2 million since the last report came out. Migrant workers now constitute over 10% of Thailand's labor force, and that figure is likely to increase in the coming years due to Thailand's demographic transformation into an aging society. The migration profile chapter concludes that it is imperative for policymakers to continue to improve the data collected on the migrant population in Thailand. Obtaining a better understanding of the nature of these movements can be used to inform the development of evidence-based and inclusive migration policies. Okay, so next chapter is on migration policy and practice in Thailand. Thailand's migration policy has long been ad hoc and characterized by unpredictability, oscillating between amnesty and crackdown. The government has struggled to formulate a long-term migration policy, instead relying heavily on periodic amnesties for irregular migrants. The most striking recent development that we've seen have been the efforts made to assert greater control over labor migration from neighboring countries, particularly through the prevention and suppression of irregular labor migration. The government has sought to encourage regular employment of migrant workers through revising its MOUs with countries of origin and applying stricter penalties for irregular migrants and their employers in Thailand. And while it's true the number of migrant workers entering Thailand through the MOU process has increased, what we see is that yes, most migrants do continue to regularize their status later through registration at one-stop service centers and the nationality verification process. Due to the costly, time-consuming, and complex procedures for the MOU process, the benefits of participating remain insufficient for many migrant workers. The chapter concludes that for Thailand to better leverage the benefits of migration, it should develop a comprehensive and long-term migration policy that addresses the key challenges, and those relate to ineffective admission and regularization processes, gaps in labor rights protection, employer-tied work permits, access to social protection schemes, barriers to financial inclusion, and lack of social cohesion. Next one. Next, we have a chapter on working conditions for migrants in agriculture. Historically, agriculture was the backbone of the Thai economy. But in recent years, it has become increasingly reliant on migrant workers to fill labor shortages. There are currently over 400,000 migrant workers employed in agriculture, and the actual number is believed to be substantially higher due to the large number of irregular migrants in the sector. Findings from a forthcoming ILO study of over 500 migrants employed in the agricultural sector revealed a number of serious concerns. Those related to high levels of informality, wages below the legal minimum, inadequate housing and living conditions, lingering problems with child labor, high risk of workplace injuries, and overexposure to pesticides. What the chapter concludes is that working conditions for migrant workers in agriculture would benefit from the introduction of reforms to expand coverage by labor and social protections, provide safe housing facilities, and improve the quality and scope of labor inspection. Next slide. So moving on, the next chapter examines access to services for migrant children. Thailand has developed a progressive policy and legislative framework for migrant children so that they can access public services. And that includes education, healthcare, and child protection. But although they are provided with this broad range of entitlements under Thai law, many migrant children continue to experience significant barriers to their use in practice. Common challenges include language barriers, negative attitudes among officials, lack of service provider capacity, and reluctance to make use of government services, particularly for migrants with irregular legal status. Migrant children are entitled to attend public school free of tuition expenses, and there are also options for non-formal education and migrant learning centers. Through these educational opportunities, which are provided by the Thai government and NGOs, more than 164,000 migrant children are enrolled in school within Thailand. At the same time, it is estimated that 200,000 migrant children remain out of school, and are not receiving any form of education. Thailand has really demonstrated a substantial commitment to ensuring that migrant children in the country are able to grow up in an environment that protects their rights and provides for their developmental needs. And really addressing the remaining gaps in effective service delivery for migrant children would ensure equitable and inclusive access to public services for all children in Thailand. Next slide. So yeah, the next chapter analyzes the impact of ASEAN integration on women migrants in Thailand. Subject I'm sure Kyoko is going to speak to later. Women make up almost half of total inter-ASEAN migrant workers and slightly more than half in Thailand. Across the ASEAN region, high demand for labor in feminized sectors of work has increased the migration of women. However, women migrant workers remain overwhelmingly segregated in low-skilled employment sectors that are associated with lower wages and weaker labor protections. Inequality, discrimination, and lack of gender-responsive information and services restrict women's access to safe migration and decent work opportunities. Because most women migrant workers are employed in low-skilled work within the informal economy in Thailand, they are largely excluded from the benefits of increased labor mobility provided by the ASEAN economic community. Even for professional women, the highly skilled occupations covered by the mutual recognition arrangements are primarily in male-dominated fields. Gender must be more thoroughly mainstreamed into the mechanisms that form the basis for the ASEAN economic community for its impact on women migrants to be beneficial. So the final chapter examines trafficking in persons in Thailand. Human trafficking in the country primarily occurs in the context of large-scale labor migration from neighboring Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Because effective recruitment systems and migration governance frameworks have not been established to facilitate the movement and regulate the employment of this workforce, they remain vulnerable to exploitation at various points during the migration process. A total of 455 individuals in Thailand were officially identified as trafficked persons in 2017. However, the real scale of the problem and whether responses have been effective in reducing its prevalence has been difficult to ascertain. There are no reliable estimates available on the total number of people trafficked in the country, and limitations on trafficking-related data remain very substantial. As most victims are not likely to be officially identified, there's a need for more proactive counter-trafficking efforts and research to inform responses. Identifying the sectors in Thailand where such exploitative practices are widespread and addressing the phenomena systematically in these high-risk industries could have a significant impact on reducing trafficking of persons. Okay, so we reached the conclusion, and that is that as documented within this report, there have been many significant developments in Thailand's migration landscape during the last 4 years. The situation continues to evolve at such a rapid pace that a report such as this can really only hope to accurately capture the events during a very brief period of time. Nevertheless, I think we do need to acknowledge that some important progress has been made on migration governance, particularly in terms of improved cooperation with NGOs and international organizations, expanding access to public services, and ratification of the relevant international standards. But the reality is that as much as the situation for migrants has changed during the last 4 years since the last Thailand migration report was produced, many of the biggest challenges are still the same. Policy responses that leave migrants perennially vulnerable and unsure of their status are a common thread running through these disparate migration issues in Thailand. Moving forward, the political will to put in place lasting commitments to protecting the human rights of migrants and refugees is essential if these challenges are to be managed more effectively. Thank you very much.
We move immediately to the next presentation.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. My name is Anna Olsen. I work for the International Labour Organization, and I've done so on a project called Triangle in ASEAN for the last 6 or so years. And that's a project that looks at migrant workers' rights across the ASEAN region. First of all, thank you so much to Sea Junction and to Leah for hosting on a Sunday afternoon, and thanks to all of you for coming on a Sunday afternoon. I will admit to being surprised as to how many people are here, so thank you. I am one of the co-authors of the chapter on working conditions for migrants in Thailand's sex industry. So first of all, I should acknowledge my co-authors, Oliver Fisher and Leo Villar, who unfortunately are not able to be here but contributed a lot to this chapter. As Leah mentioned, it is a bit of a watershed moment for the Thailand Migration Report, and certainly for the consideration of sex workers' rights within the context of migration to Thailand. Because this is the first migration report that has included a consideration of sex workers within this report. And I want to congratulate Ben for his bravery in taking that forward and steering the ship through to actual publication. I think Ben and I both assumed at some point during the year or so of drafting this that this sex work chapter would be killed and would not end up finding its way into print. So we were very pleased 2 weeks ago to finally launch with the sex work chapter included. It's going to be actually impossible to do justice to this issue in the 12 minutes that I have been allotted, so excuse me if there is a lack of nuance in some of this discussion. I'm going to try and get us through as much as possible from the chapter, but of course you have it for yourselves. The first thing that I think I should mention is that it's really unfortunate that we weren't able to engage a sex workers organisation, or indeed migrant sex workers, to actually write and contribute to this chapter ourselves, and we were forced to rely on research that had already been conducted and some secondary sources. And unfortunately, until some of the attitudes both within and beyond the UN change, that will be the situation, and this is hopefully a step in the right direction. So, sex work and migration exists in this very uncomfortable nexus between immigration control, border control, labour and business law enforcement, criminal justice systems, and this what has become this industry of counter-trafficking or anti-trafficking efforts. Sex work itself is informal, as in it's not a recognised category of job in Thailand. It's largely dominated by women, but I do want to acknowledge that sex work is performed by men, women, and those of all gender identities in Thailand. And it often exists or is conducted in the margins of more formal jobs or legitimate jobs in hospitality, tourism, and indeed any other jobs that people who may choose to also engage in sex work do. It is traditionally informal, undervalued work that is poorly protected by labour laws, and I think that is true not only in Thailand but globally. State responses reflect the convergence of all of these factors. So in Thailand, sex work remains illegal. It is a criminal practice to engage in sex work and also to engage the services of a sex worker. The conclusion, and maybe I'm burying the punchline here, but the conclusion of this chapter is that decriminalisation is the only way and the catalytic way forward for recognising migrant sex workers' rights here in Thailand. And underlying that is that policy options beyond criminalisation do actually exist and can have a significant impact on the rights of those migrant workers engaging in sex in this country. So, firstly, I guess a note on terminology. Sex work in this chapter is defined as the provision of sexual services in exchange for economic benefit between consenting women, men and transgender adults. The purpose of this definition is obviously to separate sex work and the engagement in voluntary sex work from things that it is too easily conflated with, including trafficking for sexual exploitation, rape and various other crimes of a sexual nature. We were fortunate enough in the ILO to be able to conduct some primary research interviewing sex workers in Bangkok, Chiang Mai and Pattaya, and some of the quotes that you'll see on the slides reflect some of those interviews that we were able to conduct a couple of years ago. But this one I liked in particular, which is going out with clients is up to us. If we want money, we go. If not, then we don't. There's no coercion. And that's the operational definition that this chapter applies. Research, however, in the past has focused very much on trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation rather than on the working conditions for voluntary sex workers or on sex work as a livelihood strategy for migrants. As Ben pointed out, women migrant workers in particularly are more likely to have jobs in Thailand that are underpaid, and sex work can be a livelihood strategy or a secondary job for them to be able to earn a living wage. Beyond that, the Thai sex industry does indeed provide migrant workers with opportunities to earn higher wages than are available both in their countries or communities of origin or in other sectors that might be available to them. But, like all migrant workers, migrant sex workers also face unfair wage deductions, excessive working hours, low levels of access to social protection and health, and the risk of extortion in their workplaces, including by officials and police. So the criminal nature of their work means that they are particularly vulnerable to being extorted by those around them, including the government officials. Indeed, also they face the challenge of being exploited or disadvantaged or having their human rights impacted by trafficking responses. So the traditional anti-trafficking response has been raids and rescues of individuals who may be trafficked in entertainment in sex venues. But these responses, we have found over the last 15 years, put migrant sex workers in particular at risk of further exploitation, loss of wages, stigma, and most often ultimately result in deportation. So the summary of the chapter basically outlines that criminalisation of sex work increases vulnerability to exploitation because it creates this dichotomy in the individual. You are either a criminal because you are engaging in voluntary sex work, or you're a victim of trafficking, in which case most likely you will be put in a deportation centre and eventually deported. Or you will be put in a shelter to protect you, at which point you have no livelihood strategy and no way to send money back to your family, which is probably why you've migrated in the first place. There are a bunch of different reasons why this dichotomy exists, and I definitely can't go into detail on that at the moment, but I think one of the major reasons that we conceived of this chapter and decided to include it in the Thailand Migration Report was to challenge this idea that the anti-trafficking response needs to be rescue, and that the concept of victim is central in the idea of being able to assist those who might work in the sex industry. That was a little bit convoluted. We wanted to suggest, I think, with this report that an alternative response does exist, and that is what we would call the labour approach, by considering that there may well be workers' rights that should be upheld for migrant sex workers. We kind of problematise that idea that every woman who is in the sex sector is a victim of some sort of trafficking. This quote here, I think, outlines some of those intersectional risks that are faced by migrant sex workers. And she asked, are we safe? Well, I'm at risk of being arrested by the police. I'm a foreigner, I don't have a work permit, but if there are cops around, I simply go somewhere else. Facts are very few when we are talking about sex work because it has been such a under-researched area when it comes to sex work beyond the framework of trafficking. However, the estimates we do have are of around 300,000 sex workers in Thailand, with most of those who are migrant sex workers emanating from the neighbouring countries, although there are sex workers here from all over the world, Europe, Africa, and so on. Pay is approximately double to 10 times the minimum wage, which immediately gives you a concept of the economic incentive to take that job. In 1998, so 20 odd years ago, the ILO estimated around 300 million is remitted from sex worker wages across the Asia Pacific region, and we have no idea what it is today because that piece of research unfortunately has never been able to be followed up upon. The reasons, of course, that data is so incomplete are highlighted by this quote, which is that sex workers are not willing to identify themselves to any kind of researcher or authority because obviously then they're putting themselves at risk of criminal charges, deportation, and so on. However, just upstairs a couple of weeks ago, there was this exhibition, and I think the inclusion of Empowers a sex worker organisation here in Thailand, the inclusion of Empowers exhibitions at the Bangkok Biennale is evidence of how certainly Thai society is starting to shift its attitudes around sex workers and what it is that they do within this society. Sex workers, of course, like all of us, do indeed have rights. They are scattered across various different international instruments and standards, and it's unfortunate indeed that the ILO has not been able to put together any kind of standard on sex workers' rights within the context of international labour standards. However, for anyone who wants to have this discussion in more detail, there are a number of different entry points where we can use the international legal framework to protect migrant sex workers' rights. But most importantly, and underlying the idea of work and workers' rights, was this interview with a male sex worker who stated that he wanted to work freely and to have dignity in that work. More facts are the legal barriers to recognising migrant sex workers' rights. So there are no regular channels for entry into sex work jobs. You cannot get a visa, you cannot migrate here to Thailand to get a sex work job. Business laws control the entertainment establishments, they control the nightclubs, the bars, the hotels and so on, but they do not provide a subsequent level of, or a sufficient level of rights for the workers within those workplaces. Criminal laws continue to categorise sex work as illegal and the sex worker as a criminal. They penalise also association with a sex worker, which makes it very difficult to provide healthcare, legal aid assistance or any other kinds of services to sex workers. Indeed, if you are the landlord of a sex worker's place of residence, you could be a criminal under a particular reading of the Crimes Act here in Thailand. It also prohibits assisting a sex worker in a dispute with a customer. And anti-trafficking laws, of course, enable the raid and rescue activities that we've already discussed. Labour protections available for migrant sex workers is a really difficult and interesting area at the moment. I extracted on this slide a quote from the Inspector General of the Ministry of Labour that was made just last year to the CEDAW Committee in concluding observations on Thailand, where this Inspector General from the Ministry actually said, "We regard women working in entertainment, blah, 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 to be protected by the Labour Protection Act, the Social Security Act, and the Workers' Compensation Act, and other related labour laws, the same as workers in other businesses." These are the three key labour protections in Thailand. He went on, regarding the employment of migrant workers in the entertainment sector, employers can legally employ unskilled migrant workers, both male and female, for legal activities in the establishment. Now, even if sex work remains illegal, the legal activities that sex workers often engage in for money, serving drinks, performing dances, serving food, providing escort services, would then be protected by this framework that was outlined by the Inspector General here. And this is one of the things that we hope to see, not only as a result of the CEDAW Committee's concluding observations, but also coming a little bit out of this chapter and its publication. Immediate needs, however, are some sort of firewall between migrant sex workers accessing services and finding themselves deported. So the irregularity and indeed the criminal status of migrant sex workers is a barrier to accessing services. And of course, if you are at risk of being deported or charged with engaging in a crime, you are less likely to access any kinds of services. This suggests, and I think this is at the crux of it, that the fundamental rights of the migrant sex worker are less important than the enforcement of the immigration regime, which is problematic. The impact, of course, is that employers and criminals continue to operate with impunity, illnesses go untreated, and risks for society much more broadly are increased. If we were able to create a situation where migrant sex workers were able to access services, I think we would be taking several important steps to protecting their rights. So the recommendations that the chapter came out with are to first and foremost decriminalise sex work and protect sex workers' rights through labour protection and migration laws. A lofty goal. This recommendation, unfortunately, is not evidence of a shift in the UN's position on sex work. There is no unified UN position on sex work. Various different agencies have various different get-around clauses, I suppose. We're unified, but maybe I'll speak on a personal basis. However, what we wanted to do with this chapter is to, I think, also put in the hands of activists a UN document that does recommend to decriminalise sex work as a way of increasing rights protection for migrant sex workers. Following on from that, and it's certainly as a step down, to review anti-trafficking responses that increase the risk of exploitation and violence for migrant sex workers of all genders, finding ways to conduct raids and rescues if indeed they are ever necessary, but to conduct them with a way that puts the individual sex workers' rights at the front of that process. Improving working conditions for sex workers to meet decent work standards, improving access to health and legal services, and finally, to continue the important work that is done by people who are far better at it than me, including Empower and APNSW and all of the other sex worker organisations that I've had the privilege of working with over the last few years, but to continue their work in reducing stigma and discrimination against men, women and transgender sex workers, including migrants. So thank you very much.
About this, and now to last but not least, our commentator.
So, thank you very much. I had this privilege of reading the report and reporting on this. As Ben have also mentioned, this report is very interesting. Of course, we all know that this report is a must-read for most of the people who are working on migration in Thailand, because it does give us all the required statistics and information on the issue of migration in Thailand. It's also very important that it has a very good description on policies related to migration, not only about registration, but about labor, health, education, trafficking. All these required policies and regulations are all in this book, so it's a kind of a go-to book if you want to know about policy in Thailand related to migration. It also have some of the chapters are it's edgy, as you can see from the sex work one, that it talks about decriminalization, which is very, very important that that we kind of think about how criminalization make migrant workers vulnerable. Also, it covers the agricultural laborers, which are not so much covered in many of the migration studies here, as well as the important issue of migrant children, as well as remittances. Remittances, normally we discussed about the effect of remittances on development, but this report talks about the how to send back the method part of the remittances is what is being covered. So it's a very interesting report, which is different from the former reports. But then, of course, because of this approach that they had with different authors writing different chapters, and then this does have some problems, not problems, but it then has some left behind issues that is not covered in this report. For example, the statistical overview is very short because it's only one chapter. So unlike the former ones which had a lot of chronological data that compares across years, that is not available in this one, which is a little bit of a missing area. So what you have to do is to see this one and then compare to the former report about statistical information. Also, there are some aspects that was left behind, not covered in this report. For example, issue of domestic workers or sex workers, where it's very important that sex workers are covered, but domestic workers are not very well covered in this report. Especially in this one, I want to highlight because in one of the chapters it does talk about how the discrepancy between the Lao policy and Thailand policy related to domestic workers. So the Lao, they do not allow domestic workers to come, whereas Thailand, they do allow. So that kind of discrepancy, although maybe in reality it's not really functioning, that's what it says in the chapter, but then this kind of discrepancy in policy which makes domestic workers vulnerable can be an issue, which was not kind of dealt with much more deeply. So one issue was on domestic workers. Another issue was about Thai out migration. We have heard a lot about these Thai fishers in Indonesia. So this was mentioned here and there, but then not really as a Thai out migration issue, which can also be an issue which we should not forget that it is still remains. Retirement migration, marriage migration was not included in this report, so this is something that we would like to see in the next report. Again, another area that we should not forget. Also, issue of asylum seekers were not included. Of course, asylum seekers are not really migration as such, but then they are the way that Thai government is treating asylum seekers can also be quite problematic. If you don't include it in this report, it also can get forgotten at all. Also, workers in factories were not included in this report, so the issue like the collective action, trade union, the migrant workers are not able to form their own trade unions and then cannot participate, cannot lead collective action. So this part that we have been talking about quite often, and they still remain as such, is also missing. So which we also would like to see in the next report as well. Another thing that was also, because it had different chapters, so that each topic is very much in depth, and then so we can see the focus very well, and then that's really wonderful about this report. But then what happens is that the link between these issues can become a little bit of a problem. For example, there is one chapter which talks about how unemployment rate goes down and then the migration goes up. How the internal migration in Thailand happens, and then it happens from the low-income provinces to the higher-income provinces. But then they also talk about how low. How Thai unemployment is going down, but at the same time the migration is going up, so showing that there is a great shortage of labor in Thailand. However, what is very interesting about Thailand is that now there's a very high aging society. So high aging society, especially in the rural areas, because the young people will come to Bangkok. So the rural area, the aging is higher. Is that now being subsidized by the migrants? Yeah, so that kind of linking the aging society issues with migration will be a very interesting and a very important issue for Thailand in the future. So that's another area that we'd like to also see. So in the end, some questions also. I'd like to, we have this opportunity to have the authors and the editors here. So some questions. First of all, the first question is that in the report it says that more than 80% of the traffic victims are sex workers. So that's very interesting because, like, yes, this report trying to distance the sex worker from trafficking, and that's very important perspective. But still, the traffic people, more than 80% are sex workers. What does this mean? Does this really actually mean that there's more traffic victims among the sex workers? Or is there some assumption among the law enforcer that sex workers should be all traffic people? So is that the kind of a perception, assumption that is there or not? Yeah, so maybe some kind of a maybe the author can shed some light on this issue as well. The second question is about the migrant children citizenship. So again, this one we have one chapter on this issue of status and all that. But then, so it is very difficult for many of the migrant workers who are born here can become stateless. But at the same time, we do see in newspaper, like for example, quite recently in Mesot, some other group of orphans were given Thai citizenship. So some things happen. Why does this happen? How can it happen? Can we learn something from these these successful cases so that we can also improve the situation of migrant children citizenship? So some kind of again another analysis on how can we address this issue of migrant children citizenship is very much very important. This one, the health insurance, another edgy area that is there in this report, which talks very much, it was very interesting that it talks about the health insurance scheme, the migrant health insurance scheme in Thailand. And then, so one chapter, they say that in order to have the financial and service stability, we should integrate the migrant health insurance scheme to the Thai health insurance scheme. So it's a whole integration. Don't make it separate, make it integration. Another chapter, they suggest that we should just harmonize. So not integrating, harmonize. So again, maybe the editor can also shed some light. Okay, what is some of the pros and cons of these kind of different approaches? Because again, this is a very important area of health insurance. Another issue, again, this is very interesting too. So remittance chapters you should also read because it's a very interesting chapter because it talks about formalizing remittance approach. Yeah, so because many times, as you know, they will send by agents and then they have this hundi system that they send the remittances. So this chapter talks about how we can formalize remittances flow, and then by formalizing, it would also lower the fees that they have to pay for transmitting the money. So it's good. We should also use fintech in order to also reduce the fee. Yeah, so that those kind of exploring this kind of different possibilities are there. However, there is a little bit of a problem here because like formalizing. So why do we have to formalize? Well, from the migrant perspective, what is the merit of formalizing? Yeah. So there is except for a little bit of fee difference. Maybe there's not so much purpose in formalizing. Maybe formalizing from the state perspective is important, but maybe not from the migrant workers perspective. So that's one thing. Especially because one of the cases that is mentioned here is that formalizing through MFIs. Yeah? So formalizing through MFIs, what does that mean? Meaning that, for example, the Cambodians, they borrow money from the microfinance institutions, the MFIs. And then so they borrow the money, the remittance comes through MFI, yeah, through the formalizing channel. The first thing that MFI will do is deduct all the credit that they borrow. Meaning that if you formalize the money flow, the villagers the receiver will not be able to decide by themselves what to prioritize the use of money for. And now it is informal, so you get the cash, so that's why you can make the decision, I don't want to repay this one, I want to use it for this one first. So that kind of decision making, you're not able to do if things are formalized. Yeah, is formalizing really a good thing to do? or using fintech. So using fintech, so this digital currency, and then you can also do and then there will be the fees will be much lower, and so that is what is argued that is going to be good. However, we also know that there is this digital divide between women and men in terms of use of internet, or the age differences and all that. So now most of the remittances goes to either the mother or the wife. So it normally goes to the woman. But then if you use this kind of technology, most probably the money will go to the men. So we have to be a little bit careful when we are going to advocate for fintech, because it might change the whole flow of remittances, and then get the money out of the woman's hands and go to the men's hands. The last question is about private sector, because the overview, that the recommendation do talk about this employee tied registration. So if you want to have the ID, you still need to have your employer. Now in the private sector recommendation, we do not see what the private sector can do in order not to tie the migrants. Because without the help of the private sector themselves, it is very difficult to get away from this employment type registration system, because it is the employer who wants to do it like that, because they are afraid that they pay for these workers and then the workers will run away. So we do need to engage them, but how can we do that? The recommendation for this is another question. Thank you very much.
There's a lot of questions to ask for, but I also want to have discussion with the audience, but maybe some very brief comments on some of the points. We don't need to go through all of that, just few comments, both of you, and then we will open the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Keiko, for a close read of the report there. Much appreciated. Yeah, just a few of the issues not covered. Domestic work was covered a little bit in some of the chapters, but I think largely it was just a matter that it had been addressed in the last report. And although it's a huge issue, of course, sort of wanted to cover some new territory in this edition. Asylum seekers, yes, so this was a debate within the UN working group. UNHCR considers refugees to be a completely separate category from migrants. They thought it would perhaps cause some conflation of issues to include their own chapter on refugees, so they declined to author a chapter. That said, not all UN agencies agree on that point, particularly IOM does not agree. So many of the agencies did include bits and pieces on asylum seekers and refugees within the report, and the statistical data actually does include asylum seekers and refugees as well. Yeah, actually the issue on trade unions and collective bargaining was raised in the other launch event as well. And why did we not say enough about it? It's a very challenging issue. Anna has been very involved in some of Triangle's organizing efforts here in Thailand. I think there is a bit of fatigue on this issue, frankly, just in terms of not seeing much progress in terms of ratification of the international labor standards related to freedom of association and collective bargaining, but also just in terms of advocacy to change the domestic laws. So I think that's part of it. Within the fishing chapter, there is some discussion of this issue. And in particular, I think what they raised was that their survey suggests migrants within the fishing sector really want to organize, and they're not able to because of the laws prohibiting that from taking place. Yeah, so in terms of citizenship of migrant children, obviously it's been in the news quite a bit as of late. The chapter looks at providing birth registration but it doesn't actually address, to any great extent, a path to citizenship. I think it's a very, very challenging political issue in Thailand. I actually would say it's a gap more broadly within migration policy, that you have migrants in Thailand who have now been here for decades. They're going to be needed in the long term because Thailand is an aging society, and there's no policy that would provide them with a path to citizenship. So I think it's a big issue, and unfortunately maybe not as carefully addressed as it could have been. Harmonizing versus integration of health insurance. Yeah, I mean, the reality is there are different perspectives within the UN about, the way forward. I would say the WHO's perspective is probably the best informed on this issue. I'm willing to go that far. And I think they had more suggested integration as the way forward, because then you don't have sort of different classes of insurance for different workers in Thailand. I mean, personally, from a rights perspective, I think that makes a lot of sense. Why formalize remittances? It's a very hard one. This is the UNCDF perspective again, so I don't want to speak for them. They, I think, believe that if you formalize remittances, you add to the foreign exchange income of countries, and it goes through the banking system, so it can provide migrants with a greater access to other kinds of financial services if those are formalized. I absolutely am sympathetic with your point of view that why is it necessarily in migrants' best interest, because informal remittances are cheaper and quicker and more convenient. Why is it necessary to formalize? But again, this is the UNCDF perspective, so I won't try to necessarily defend it. Yeah.
Ooh, yeah, I'm going to deal with that first point up there, which I can hardly bear having that. There's so many things wrong with this. I can't remember exactly where it is in the chapter. To start off with, sex workers are not trafficking victims. So if you're a sex worker, the definition implies that you are not a victim of trafficking. So that's unfortunately conflating the issues even within that 7 or 8 words. And of course, more than 80% of those who are identified as victims are coming from the sex sector, because that's where the police look. And they tend to disregard the concept that anybody who's working in those places has the agency to make that choice, and therefore easily assume that everybody who's working there is a sex worker. It's extremely unfortunate that we keep having this statistic come out from various UN agencies that the majority of trafficking victims are indeed in the sex sector. I think it's problematic, and we need to reject it every time we see it, or at least look a little deeper into where that data is being gathered from and how selectively those victims are being chosen and then identified. So I can't handle having it that.
Okay, let's put it out. I must say, maybe for those who are not familiar with this kind of report, this has been done for many years. Of course, the best one is 2009. Which is the one I did. But after a while, I mean, this is quite new, because this is done by the UN agencies themselves. Now, in my time, UNHCR was there still. So there was something about refugees and asylum seeker and all the rest. But this time, it's the agency themselves who have written the chapter. This is quite different. So there were always consultation, and I can tell you that you are grilled by 15 agencies, not very pleasant. You want to say and not to say and how to compromise. But in this case, they have written themselves. So it's a different approach, which I think we need to keep in mind, because some of this discrepancy is because different agencies writing different chapters. Despite of the skill of the editor, for sure there is going to be inconsistency there. Now with this, I open the floor. 1, 2, third one, 3. Okay.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Rebecca from ILO. I wanted to just follow on this statistics conversation on trafficking statistics and note that most trafficking statistics, such as in the UNODC Global TIP report, for instance, are based on administrative data. So that means that governments are reporting data on traffic persons who come across their radar. So when somebody walks into a police station, somebody is picked up by immigration and identified as traffic, then those people, that's administrative data rather than a prevalence data, which would be a large survey. And so it's catching a certain bias among officials who we have trained over the last 20, 30 years to think that trafficking is very closely related to sex work. So data very often reflects that bias. On trade unions, I wanted to say that I had a meeting yesterday with the government and learned that the law had been amended and it just passed National Assembly and will come into effect soon, so migrant workers can be on leadership boards with a ratio of up to 1 to 5 can be migrants on leadership boards. So yeah, that's a good news kind of update. And then I also wanted to touch on and because Kyoko's here also touch on the housing issue and ask about how housing is considered within the labor rights perspective or not in Thailand. Is it in the labor inspection remit or not? And throw that question.
Thank you very much to all three of you. My name is Simon. I'm a migration researcher from Bonn University. Benjamin, you mentioned at the beginning these cat herding and how difficult it is to bring all these topics together. Nevertheless, I wanted to ask how it comes that international migration from Thailand, international migrants, we have 1.2 million migrants from Thailand in different parts of the world. How comes it's not in this report? And could you maybe explain a bit about this cat herding? Maybe it's related to this. Not sure.
I guess from Cambodia, please.
Yeah, thank you and Saganda, Ben and Sugar for your presentation. My name is Sokcha. I'm from the Legal Support for Children and Women. I'm working in Cambodia. I think I'm really interested in 2 points. First, when we talk about the human trafficking, I really impressed with the victim identification, but I did not see in the recommendation. One of my observations, like if you look at the report and the number of trafficking was identified is very small compared to the migrant worker in Thailand, compared to the amount of abuse explored in Thailand. And I think the problem is because those people will be recognized, will be identified through the legal system, not really working. Sometimes the migrant workers themselves did not dare to report because they are under threat of the employer, because they did not have the document. So I just talked with, I think before I came here, I talked with the return migrant who experienced exploitation, wage withdrawal, document confiscation. But when I asked them why did not report to the police, they said that how can I report when my employer already told me that if I report the police will arrest me. So sometimes, you know, when the state only recognize something, but the the, uh, the amount of people is still left from the identification. And you know, and sometimes this become a common issue. When I talk with them in Cambodia, for my people to Cambodia, they say that, oh, it is my common issue. One time I experienced this, but maybe another time I will be experience a difference. So sometimes the trafficking issue become a common issue they accepted. I did not talk in general trafficking, maybe exploitation and rape, something. This is the one I did not read the whole report. I just came here and see a really interesting. Second thing really important, because one of the recommendations on labor inspection, you focus only on industry. It means that the fishing and also the agriculture industry. How about the construction industry? When you look at the construction side, construction industry, construction supply chain is very complicated. Why the application of the subcontractor very complicated in the process. I talked with some people from Cambodia who used to work in construction. They said that my subcontractor hired me to work in this construction company, but then he ran away. I don't know where I can get the pay. You know, this is something I think really important. If we look more on the construction industry and the most labor right violation and also the compliance, it's not only fulfill applied in here the sexual work.
Thank you very much. So this time we start with Kyoko and then we go there.
So maybe I'll just refer to the housing issue. Yes, I think in the report also it does talk about how housing is being treated, and then how like the government also wants housing was also used as kind of a means to segregate the migrants from the rest of the society, like by having a kind of concentrated area for migrants to stay. So that kind of discourse also comes in the Thai government, but then it did not really get implemented, but this kind of discourse do happen. So in that sense, rather than really looking at housing as a human rights issue, that is something that are basic needs that the migrant workers should have access to, it is more seen as a way to how to control migrant workers and then their mobility. So, so in that sense, yes, I think housing is a very important issue that we should look at because it is not seen as a basic need.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, labor inspection should cover housing issues because the OSH Act is within the mandate of the Department of Labor Protection and Welfare. It's a fairly new law, and my understanding is that it hasn't necessarily been operationalized in labor inspection modules across sectors, and in particular when you're talking about like an industry like fishing where it's very challenging to meet the housing standards on board a fishing vessel. They just haven't quite figured out how to implement the law yet. But it is my understanding that at least in theory, will at some point be included within labor inspection. And as the agricultural chapter points out, it is definitely a huge need for migrants working in agriculture because often they're living in these sort of ramshackle encampments without any bathroom facilities, without clean water, etc., etc. So it definitely is an issue that needs to be addressed more through labor inspection. The question about why Thai migrants weren't addressed in the report, they actually are addressed a bit. So the profile chapter does talk about, it has some data on out-migration of Thais, and it does talk about sort of the profile of Thais leaving Thailand, which channels they're using. There have been some high-profile issues as of late, particularly for Thais working in Israel, of course. I'm sure many of you have heard about that. As to why it wasn't really covered in more depth, I think it was just not prioritized by the UN agencies who submitted chapters. There are so many migration issues that frankly could have been covered. In past reports, it has been a bit more extensive in terms of analysis about migration. And this report, people really just said, okay, the biggest issues are related to immigration. Let's focus on that. But yeah, I mean, there certainly are issues that could be addressed in the report.
Maybe I'll just quickly respond a little bit to the question that Softa had around inspection. You're absolutely right to highlight construction as an area where there is a huge lack of labour inspection, including on the housing standards that are provided to construction workers, migrant construction workers here in Thailand. But I think the fact is that lack of dedicated labour inspection not only affects all of the migrant industries in Thailand, but it's a national insufficiency of investment in the labour inspectorate, in the number of labour inspectors themselves. There's less than 1,000 across Thailand, and unfortunately that whole inspectorate is not resourced in a way that can ever really respond to the workforce in Thailand. And certainly, I think from the ILO's perspective and perhaps from the more broad perspective of the Thailand Migration Report, we see investment in that labour inspectorate as one of the best ways to protect the rights of migrant workers, including those who are working in the informal sectors. But unfortunately, that's probably a few years ago.
Okay, we last round, yes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So okay, this is the last very quick. First.
Thank you. I'm Jamal, studying the migrants in Thailand. On the page 35, it's very interesting that already mentioned about the acculturation. So before acculturation on the page 35, because migrant itself, they need to express their culture. So as far as we know that multiculturalism in Thailand is a bit lower rather than other neighboring countries. So by taking focus on the acculturation process, acculturation strategy, then many aspects can be related. In political aspect, there are some research papers mention acculturation related to political aspect, acculturation related to the security aspect, and by giving the chance for the migrants to integrate or to assimilate into the Thai society, then in the future the aging population will have the chance to solve. Thank you.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. My name is Nathan. I'm a consultant with the ILO, but please note that what I'm sharing here is coming from my personal sort of experience and observation, and does not reflect anything with the ILO. So I would like to bring a discussion relating to the housing and universal sort of health coverage into a more broader discussion. First of all, from my sort of working experiences with the agriculture, we realized that, well, the supply chain go into multi-layers. First of all, we talk about housing. It's going to be with people, migrant working in sector in urban area would have to be require a very different type of housing than those working in rural areas of migrants. And then culturally speaking, well, I did a lot of lit review, and there are 2 studies covering on this where migrants themselves chose to choose different type of community together, like Cambodian would like to gather in their own style of housing. For example, if they work in rural area, they would like to create their own mini version of Cambodian village. While Myanmar's and Laos more prefer to be stay closer to Thai community. And we also like to consider about their incomes because, like for example, in agricultural sectors in rural area, the income is really low. Honestly speaking, way below the minimum wage because they informalities. And from that, how can you expect the public health service to look over that when that should be something that we can also consider an option to subsidize it into NGO, into CSO, because, for example, if you're familiar with Metal Clinic in the border of tax, they're actually very, very well-functioning NGO who provide very, very decent public service for migrant workers. And then if we talk on a higher level, like if we really look into the supply chain, how much can labor inspection from the government perspective really be inspected, because farmer themselves doesn't earn a lot of income. Also, the income, another layers of extraction from bigger businesses, bigger merchants. So I think we really have to look into the bigger pictures and see it as a race to the bottom. And because of the race to the bottom, how can we address it by multi-layers and multi-approaches? That would be a way better than tackle many things. Yes.
Next, I think there is someone question from somebody watching the live streaming.
So the question from home is from the person named Lin. She is like interested in like more information sharing or like different kind of informal migration, including those who are not like purely labor migrants. For example, migration from neighboring countries increasingly include environmental migration, and this does not include labor and economic motive for migration, but it involves new and different factors in the migrant situation at the origin and destination, as well as the capacity to return. Okay.
Okay, there were two more. Rebecca, yes, and then you are the last. No other.
This is probably a bit too, sorry, my name's Rebecca, I work for the British Council, but I'm also doing research into refugee education in Bangkok. It's probably a little bit too soon to ask this, but I noticed that you obviously presented the report to the Thai government, and I mean, it would be very interesting to know what their kind of response is, because at the end of the day, I mean, obviously at the moment the elections are coming up, so you know, migration is always a sort of controversial issue around this time. But I just feel like, you know, so many things in that report are really, really positive and you know, really progressive. Like, for example, some of the educational initiatives that have taken place. But one of the biggest barriers is, you know, immigration control. And for example, you know, refugees being arrested outside of their community learning centers that they go to, schools being targeted. You know, all these things make it so difficult for migrants, whether they're legal or illegal, to access, you know, services like education, like healthcare. So, you know, I kind of think until that massive legal barrier is kind of overcome, then all of these initiatives are going to be so difficult to kind of push forward. So, you know, it would be really interesting to find out what the overall kind of Thai government response to this report is.
Hi, thank you guys. My name is Emily. I research human rights issues in Myanmar. And I was just really interested to see the chapter on sex work. I thought that was amazing. And just a general question about maybe some insider perspective, if there's any movement to develop some kind of instrument to formalize labor rights for sex workers in any of the agencies. Just curious about that.
And last but not least, is any recommendation of changing the registration system for migrants from Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar?
Okay, sorry, while Ben's still taking notes, I'm going to take the microphone. I will deal with first a question from Emily. Sadly, perhaps sadly, the ILO is not in a position to develop, unfortunately, a standard like the Domestic Workers Convention in sex work. But there are numerous different ways in, and at the moment, the ILO is developing a standard on violence and harassment in the world of work, which is thought that it will cover violence and harassment, including in the informal workplaces, which gives us a new entry point to discussing sex workers' rights as workers' rights. However, and I'm happy to have this discussion, perhaps not with everybody, within the nature of the International Labour Conference, there's been a lot of pushback around including sex workers and the work that they do within this new standard, and it's coming from the states that you would probably imagine would be objecting to that kind of thing. So it's a fraught battle at the moment, but we're hopeful that will give us another entry point for having that discussion in an international standards perspective. I was actually at the meeting on the Thai government response, and it was just while taking some of your answer away, it was really interesting from my perspective. We really did think that the sex work chapter was going to get a lot of attention and a lot of negative attention, and it didn't. And in fact, without saying anything terrible, I was quite personally surprised at how unconcerned the Thai government was about the contents of this report. Obviously, they were concerned about the correct facts and the laws being reflected in the correct way, which was extremely helpful to me as an author of the chapter, but they did not seem to be terribly concerned about the discourse that this report would be starting, or the political repercussions that might be coming out from it. To me, that it was surprising and obviously a little bit disappointing, but I think it also speaks to the way governments are treating migration issues at the moment, and the ability to be able to discard or disregard the concerns around migrants in your country.
Just want to I think the word that you mentioned, that capacity to return, is quite interesting, but it is also capacity to remain. So both ways, I mean, it's a very important thing. I think that's what I also highlight.
Okay, there are a lot of questions, so I'll do my best here. Yeah, the question about the section on social cohesion and why migrants are not really permitted to assimilate. I mean, I think what IWEM was trying to do is show that there are different models for how governments work on social cohesion, and that largely what you see in Thailand is quite a segregationist approach. It's not sort of allowing migrants to really be a part of the political, economic, and social life of Thailand. I think these questions are going to come up in the future because Thailand needs more workers, and it's an aging society, and unemployment is low. So I mean, all the factors are there for needing more young workers. I think these questions are going to have to come up in policy discussions at some point. Nathan's credit, I mean, it was a little bit broad, Nathan, so I'll do my best. But I think you raised this question about public health. And is public health really the answer for providing services to irregular migrants? We actually included a recommendation within the report, and this was sort of me extrapolating a little bit from what WHO was suggesting, that I think it's a real challenge for the public health system to universally cover irregular migrants. They're not necessarily going to be comfortable accessing government facilities. There is a space that NGOs can fill in providing those services, like Maytal does, like many NGOs do, and actually suggesting that the government should look to fund some of those services to make them more sustainable. Because if you know Maytal, you know that they are always struggling to find funding to continue to exist. So that's one recommendation that was included in the report. Environmental migration as a motivation for coming to Thailand, I think was the question. I mean, the reality right now is that I think even within the international framework for refugees, environmental migrants are not recognized yet. Is that correct? Maybe someone will correct me.
It is correct.
Yeah. And I think what you see in Thailand is that really a lot of the migration is kind of mixed migration in a way. Migrants may be coming because they need a job, but there are also, in some cases, conflict situations or poverty or these other push factors which make it a bit more complex in terms of what their reasons are for migrating. At the moment, Thailand doesn't even have a national legal framework recognizing the status of refugees, so they certainly don't have one that recognizes environmental migrants as a particular status within Thailand. So yeah, I mean that could certainly increase in the future and maybe will be an emerging issue for policy development. Yeah, the Thai government's response to the report, I mean, Anna already spoke to this a little bit. I think we were quite surprised. I think the report is quite critical in many areas. And we will have a more in-depth consultation with the Thai government when the full report is translated. So they could still change their minds about it. But yeah, I mean, most of the feedback that they provided was quite just sort of factual, like you need to correct this data, you need to update this data, you need to correct this source. One issue they did push back on was from the Royal Thai Police on corruption issues noted within the report. Frankly, it's a pretty well accepted reality that there's quite a bit of informal payments made by irregular migrants to the police. So we decided not to take it out.
The biggest barriers, one of the biggest abuses that happens is by the police and by the immigration. So that's why it's such a key issue. I mean, I can understand why they resist it. To me, it's one of the biggest.
Yeah, no, I mean, legal status in Thailand, which is, for migrants, is always fluctuating. They're always having to find a new way to stay in Thailand legally. That usually means at some point they're irregular and they have to make payments to any place to stay here. I think that's a pretty well established fact in Thailand. Leah's last question about changing the registration system. Yeah, I mean, so, sorry. Yeah. I think within migration circles it's been discussed for a while that the MOUs really don't seem like the answer at this point. And then could you develop a much more simplified mechanism that would allow migrants to come to Thailand, like a job seeker visa, just register at the border, enter, find a job, and then complete their documentation. So that recommendation actually is included in the report. I guess we'll have to see what kind of response we get from the Thai government on that one. I think there will be some reluctance, frankly. One of the reasons we have kind of the messy registration system that we do now is because some people make a lot of money off of it. And taking away that incentive will be difficult.
So, big applause.